Hello, Biology 158. Welcome to our first chapter we're going to be covering for the summer. It's going to be all about the cardiovascular system, focusing on blood. So to start out, what are some functions of blood? So your blood actually has a lot of different jobs it does within the body. First one is all about transport. So gases, things like oxygen, carbon dioxide, any nutrients it has to move to certain organs, any waste products it has to pick up from those organs, any molecules that have been processed, like ATP, as well as hormones for long distance signaling. Secondly, your blood is a big regulator. So it is able to detect if the blood is getting too acidic or too basic and adjust accordingly, but also if the blood doesn't have enough or has too much water in it. Additionally, as part of that regulation job, it's also responsible for maintaining body temperature. So if there are changes in body temperature, it's getting too hot or too cold, the body will adjust accordingly. Additionally, your blood has a very important function for your immune system. You have white blood cells, which are specialized to destroy invaders from infecting cells, from reproducing, from preventing you from getting sick. And then lastly, your blood is responsible for forming clots, so you don't have excessive bleeding. So blood itself, as you learned from Biology 157, is a type of connective tissue, meaning that it has a liquid matrix as well as any sort of cells or cell fragments that make up the tissue. And blood, like all connective tissue, has two pieces. For the liquid matrix, the outer portion is called the plasma. And then the actual cells and cell fragments are called the formed elements. And we can further break down the plasma matrix and the formed elements into additional subcategories. So for your plasma breaks down into a couple different categories. It breaks down into proteins, mostly water, and then a little bit of other solutes. So your proteins are your albumins, globulins, and fibrinogen. Then you have a lot of your other solutes like ions, nutrients, gases, etc. And then for your formed elements, that's the actual living component of the blood, you have a couple different cell types. You have your red blood cells, which make up the majority. You have your white blood cells, and then you have your platelets. And your white blood cells break down into 5 different kinds, but we'll talk about that in a moment. So starting out with the plasma has 3 different components to itself. First one, the largest component, like I mentioned, is water. The second one is your solutes, again, things like ions, nutrients, waste products, gases, anything that is being carried by the blood, either to an organ system, or to be removed from the body. And then you have those 3 protein components. There's albumins, globulins, and fibrinogen. So your albumins are largely responsible for maintenance. So they're going to maintain what's called viscosity. That's the resistance to flow, the pressure and pH as well. They do have a little bit of transport with your fatty acids and then specifically the thyroid hormone, but your albumins are largely responsible for maintaining the qualities of blood. Then you have your globulins, the second protein component, and these are all about transport. So pretty much anything that's not a fatty acid or a thyroid hormone, so carbs, hormones, or any other hormone outside of thyroid, ions, antibodies, blood complement, lipids, you name it, it's all under globulins. So when you think globulins, think transport. And then lastly, your third component is fibrinogen, and that is all about assisting with blood clotting. Then within the plasma, you have your solute components. So all of the different things that your blood can carry. So your ions, which are responsible for processes like osmosis with the diffusion of water, membrane potentials with having ions like sodium and potassium moving into and out of the cell for something like an action potential, as well as your acid-base balance. Your nutrients, so things like glucose for cellular respiration, amino acids for building proteins, fats, vitamins, those are all nutrients that can be transported through the plasma. Additionally, things like lactic acid from cellular respiration, bilirubin from the liver are all waste products that, again, will be carried away from the organ system to be removed from the body. You have your gases that are going to be carried by blood. So your oxygen is going to be carried from the lungs to the tissues, and then your carbon dioxide is going to be carried from your tissues after the oxygen has been used to respire to produce carbon dioxide. And then also in the plasma, it's going to carry those substances like hormones for long distance signaling, as well as enzymes for carrying out reactions. All right, so with our formed elements, again, this is the living components of blood. You have three different blood cell types. You have your red blood cells, which are also called your erythrocytes, your white blood cells, which are called your leukocytes, and then your platelets, which are called your thrombocytes. So your red blood cells are responsible for carrying oxygen from the lungs to the tissues. Your white blood cells primarily are responsible for your immune system, so again, defending the body against foreign invaders. And there's two different kinds of white blood cells. You have what's called your granulocytes and your agranulocytes. So granulocyte means that the cytoplasm outside the nucleus has a very grainy texture to it. And then agranulocytes with the prefix A means without. So the cell cytoplasm for these types of white blood cells doesn't seem to have that grainy, fine structure to it like your granulocytes. But three types of granulocytes are your neutrophils, your eosinophils, and your basophils. And then your agranulocytes have two types, your lymphocytes and your monocytes. And we'll go through all of those in a couple slides. And then your platelets are responsible for your blood clotting. So here is a diagram showing you the three different types of blood cell types within your blood. So red blood cells here, they have that distinct disc shape. Your white blood cells here, and then your platelet fragments here. So the process by which you actually produce blood cells is called hematopoiesis. And this is how we form everything. It's how we form our red blood cells, how we form our white blood cells, how we form our platelets. And they all come from what are called stem cells. These are cells that have yet to be differentiated into a specific role in the body. So all the stem cells are a single population, and they all differentiate into a type of blood cell. So your red blood cells originate from something that's called proerythroblast. Your basophils, neutrophils, and eosinophils, those are your granulocytes for your white blood cells, originate by what's called myoblast. Your lymphocytes come from what are called lymphoblasts. That one's pretty easy because you have lympho in the name. Same with the monocytes. Those come from your monoblast. And then lastly, your platelets come from what are called megakaryoblast. Now, an easy way to remember or to help remember with these types of cells that is the suffix blast right here. So if you see any time in biology the suffix blast, that means an immature cell. If you ever see the suffix cyte, C-Y-T-E, that means a mature cell. So a red blood cell, another name for that, is an erythrocyte. So that's a mature red blood cell. And it comes from the immature proerythroblast. So we know immature is blast, and then it develops into mature cyte. So easy way to help you out. Same idea with lymphocytes. So cyte, we know, is a mature white blood cell. Lymphoblast is an immature white blood cell. And then lastly, the actual process by which we produce red blood cells is through a certain hormone, and that is called erythropoietin. So hematopoiesis is the entire process of producing any kind of blood cell, platelet, red cell, white cell. Erythropoietin is a special hormone that's responsible for just red blood cell production. And here's a quick diagram to show you all the differentiation that occurs with your blood cells. So you don't need to know this whole thing, but just to point out some key features, all the cells originate from this cell up here called a hemocytoblast. Remember, blast means immature cell. And then that hemocytoblast differentiates into those 5 precursor cells. So proerythroblast, megakaryoblast, myeloblast, monoblast, and lymphoblast. And those all correspond to red blood cell, the platelets, the granulocytes, which are the basophils, the eosinophils, and the neutrophils, and then your agranulocytes, which are your monocytes and your lymphocytes. So just know the precursor cells and what those precursor cells develop into. Okay, so starting with our red blood cells, or your erythrocytes, these cells are responsible for carrying your oxygen to your tissues, and they have a unique disc shape that allows them to be really, really flexible and really bendy. That attribute of the cell is really important for allowing them to be able to fit and squeeze themselves through the blood vessels, particularly when they constrict and decrease their diameter. They contain a handful of different things. The most important thing that they contain is hemoglobin. That's the molecule that ultimately allows oxygen to bind to it. But they can also carry things like lipids, your ATP molecule for energy, as well as your carbonic anhydrase. And your carbonic anhydrase is important because that is what most of your carbon dioxide is transported as. And like I mentioned, your red blood cells are largely there to transport oxygen from your lungs to your tissues, but you also transport carbon dioxide from your tissues back to the lungs to be removed from the body. And it's mostly transported as bicarbonate ions, which is contributed by your carbonic anhydrase. So that key protein within your red blood cells is your hemoglobin. And that hemoglobin has 4 subunits, so 4 individual pieces that make up the hemoglobin itself. And for each subunit or each piece, that has 2 components. So you have a globulin, which is a single polypeptide, so just a single protein chain. And that single polypeptide has a pigment called heme bound to it. And that pigment then has an iron atom with it. So we put the words together, heme and globin makes hemoglobin. So you have both those components. And when we have oxygen bound to hemoglobin, we refer to it as oxyhemoglobin. When we have oxygen not bound to hemoglobin, we refer to it as deoxyhemoglobin. And then we have hemoglobin bound to carbon dioxide, we call it carboaminohemoglobin. So think of it as like 3 different states of being for the hemoglobin. And here is a picture of your hemoglobin molecule. So all 4 pieces, you have 2 alpha chains, so alpha 1, alpha 2, and then 2 beta chains, beta 2, beta 1. So 4 pieces that make up the entire molecule. And what I'm drawing my mouse over is one of the protein chains, one of the globulin molecules, or polypeptides, and it's bound to a heme molecule. That is this blue disc I'm circling right here. So you have 4 of those that make up the hemoglobin molecule. And for our red blood cells that contain that hemoglobin, they have a very special pathway by which they're produced. So when you have a state of decreased blood oxygen within the body, whether that's due to not enough red blood cells or blood cells that have been damaged and need to be replaced, what happens is that decrease in blood oxygen levels is picked up by the kidney. Any blood that's flowing to the kidney is able to sense that blood oxygen levels have decreased. And when this happens, you ultimately have the kidneys produce that hormone we talked about, erythropoietin, that's responsible specifically for producing red blood cells. The kidney will produce that hormone, and that hormone will travel through the bloodstream to the bone marrow. And with that signaling from that hormone, you'll have an increase in red blood cell production. More blood cells will then go into the bloodstream, allowing for more oxygen to be bound to those hemoglobin molecules within the red blood cells, which will ultimately increase the blood oxygen altogether. And additionally, you won't have red blood cells that are constantly, are able to last forever. Red blood cells will last anywhere from 100 to 120 days, and then they'll sort of break down and have to be destroyed and removed because they're not functioning as properly. That process of breaking down blood cells is called hemolysis. And when we have red blood cells that need to be broken down, we also need to break down that hemoglobin, that protein within the red blood cells themselves. And what happens is you have molecules that are called macrophages that take up that hemoglobin from any red blood cells that are broken. So hemolysis is the process of breaking the red blood cell down. But the macrophage is going to take that hemoglobin molecule within the red blood cell and then break it down. And what's going to happen is that globulin polypeptide is going to be broken down into its individual amino acids that make up the polypeptide. And then your heme, that red pigment, what's going to happen is the iron molecule bound to it is going to be released. And that pigment, that what actually makes the red color, is going to be converted to bilirubin before going to the liver. And then the liver is going to process it and ultimately excrete it from the body. Okay. So that's your red blood cells. That's the first type of formed elements. Now we're talking about white blood cells, the second type of formed element. So, like I mentioned, we have your granulocytes, which have these large granule structures within the cytoplasm. And we have neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils that make up your granulocytes. Then we have your agranulocytes, where the granular structure is not really easily seen, so it almost looks like they don't have that structure in the cytoplasm. And those two cell types are your lymphocytes and your monocytes. Ultimately, the primary function for your white blood cells is to protect the body from foreign microbes. It is part of your immune system. So going through each type of white blood cell, focusing on the granulocytes now. First one's called the neutrophil. These are a majority of your white blood cells. Ultimately, their job is to phagocytize bacteria, meaning they're going to engulf any foreign bacterial elements and break them down. And they have a special substance to do this that's called a lysozyme. So these neutrophils are able to secrete the lysozyme. And that lysozyme is actually able to digest bacterial cell walls and cause the cells to lose their structural integrity. So those are your neutrophils. Next, we have your eosinophils. And your eosinophils are all about controlling the inflammatory response. So you have a molecule that's called histamine, that's part of your immune system, that acts as an inflaming agent. So it swells cells up and increases blood flow. And ultimately, when you have cells that are inflamed, such as through an allergic response, that eosinophil is going to inactivate that histamine. So it can't do its job, so it can't cause those cells to swell up, such as through an allergic reaction. Additionally, your eosinophils are responsible for destroying parasitic organisms within the blood. Next, we have your basophils. These are your least common type of white blood cells, but they kind of do the opposite of your eosinophils. They're responsible for the inflammatory response. So they're actually going to produce your histamine, as well as another molecule called your heparin, which is going to ultimately induce the inflammatory response. So for example, if a virus is within the cell and you have it's starting to spread, the body will, or those basophils will release histamine and heparin to inflame those cells to prevent the spread of that virus, for example. So those were your granulocytes. Now we're talking about the agranulocytes. And the first one is your lymphocytes. These are produced in your red bone marrow, like your red blood cells. But unlike your red blood cells, they're not about carrying oxygen and carbon dioxide to the bloodstream. They're about antibody production. And antibodies are responsible for binding to foreign substances to inactivate them. So anything that's not supposed to be there and the body deems as foreign, it's going to inactivate them so they can't potentially hurt the body. And then the second type of agranulocyte and last type of white blood cell are called your monocytes. And these are phagocytic cells, so they're going to phagocytize any foreign agents or foreign materials. And ultimately, their job is to break down those foreign materials or your antigens. Okay, so your last type of formed element is called your platelets. So again, these are just fragments. They're not full cells like your red blood cells and your white blood cells, but they come from your megakaryocytes. and your megakaryocytes originate as megakaryoblasts. So those immature form of platelets develop into megakaryocytes, which form your platelets. Ultimately, your platelets are very sticky. They're able to bind to collagen fibers within the tissue. And ultimately, their job is to prevent blood loss. They're going to form what are called platelet plugs, as well as contribute to the formation of clotting.